Hello everyone, and welcome to this series of videos on macroevolution, which I'm recording from a blustery autumnal day here in Manchester. I thought we could start our videos by looking at adaptation. So it's always sensible, I think, to start by defining terms. So we have to ask ourselves what an adaptation is if we're going to talk about it sensibly. So an adaptation is a concept that, like many others, spans many scales of evolution. More specifically, I suppose we could call an adaptation an adaptive trait. So it's a trait that something has that's an adaptation to something. I've put a more useful definition than that on the slide for you here. An adaptation is a characteristic or suite of characteristics that fits an organism both generally and specifically to exploit a given environmental zone. The word also implies that the feature has survived because it assists its possessor in existing in a niche. What that means basically is that an adaptation is a feature that is common in a population because it provides some improved function for that organism. Adaptations typically reflect the function that they provide, and they are the result of natural selection. They can take a bewildering range of forms. So I chose to demonstrate that by giving you a single example. So we can, as that example, look at the many ways that animals can try and avoid predators. Obviously, being eaten is bad for your ability to provide offspring and therefore will reduce your fitness. So you want to try and minimize the chances that happens. So adaptations to reduce predation can be behavioral, and there are examples of this shown on this slide here. So the first one on the left-hand side here, this is a praying mantis, and it's showing a diamatic behavior. That means a threatening or startling behavior to distract or scare predators. In the middle is an example of an ungulate. This is an impala doing something called stotting. This is a high jump with stiff legs and an arched back. This shows it has a high level of fitness to any potential predators, and hopefully will make it less likely that a predator will be likely to try and chase them down because it suggests that they will outrun a predator. So it's another behavioral adaptation to reduce predation. The example on the far right-hand side here is a thing called thanatosis, or playing dead, thus avoiding predators because predators will typically go and look for living food. It's also worth noting that thanatosis, this playing dead, can also be used as a lure by predators. So, these things swing both ways. But nevertheless, those are behavioral adaptations towards avoiding predation. But in addition to those behavioral adaptations, there are also obvious physical adaptations that have evolved within animals to help them avoid predation. And some examples of these are shown on the slide here. On the far left-hand side, here you can see an example of camouflage in a bird. So there are examples of this found throughout the animal kingdom where animals will change or evolve different coloration to allow them to blend into their background, making them less likely to fall prey to a predator. Alternatively, and I suppose fairly similar in terms of kind of how you may think about these things, we can expect to see at times mimicry in the animal kingdom. Here you can see an example of this in the form of a leaf insect, which has evolved to look much like the plant upon which it lives. And the difference between that and camouflage is that in mimicry, this leaf insect is mimicking another organism, again, to try and reduce the risk that it is preyed upon. Some animals, however, go the other way, and instead of blending in some way or another, become really, really obvious to predators. This is a thing called aposematism, and it advertises to predators that an organism with bright colouring will have some form of defence. Either it won't be nice to eat, or maybe it can sting you. My example here is a sea slug, which has this really gnarly black, blue, and yellow colouring that says very clearly, "Please don't eat me." And of course, you can have animals that mimic that aposematic signal as well. So this on the right-hand side here is an example of a hoverfly. It's a fly, but it looks a lot like a wasp. So it's saying with that vibrant coloring, oh, I have the ability to sting you, even though it doesn't, spoilers. Therefore, maybe you don't want to prey upon me. And so those are all just examples of adaptations that can help organisms avoid predators. It's just one of any number of examples that I could have chosen for you for this lecture. But I wanted to give you another example that just shows how adaptations can actually be startling in their complexity. This is a really cool example of an adaptation, but I should warn you that if you don't like snakes or indeed spiders, or if you really, really like birds, you may want to skip past this video and move on to the next bit or the next slide after this. But with that said, let me play the video. So here you can see a tree trunk, and on that tree trunk is something that looks like a spider just happily wandering around every now and then. So very, very happily, an everyday scene, just a spider wandering around on a tree trunk. You can see it moving again there. So all is good. Isn't this exciting? Oh, and look at that. A bird just tried to eat the spider, but it turns out that's not a spider. That's the tail of a snake. And that bird has now become prey to that snake. It was lured in by that incredible adaptation, this spider-like caudal-like tail of this snake, thinking it was about to get a tasty treat, but has in fact just died. So that's sad, but a really cool example of the complexity of the adaptations can reach after hundreds of millions of years of evolution. But bear in mind that adaptations do occur at all scales. I just chose to give you examples so far of morphological adaptations in animals. And those will, of course, have a complex genetic underpinning. They will reflect changes in the DNA that are filtered through development to changes in morphology. But do bear in mind that adaptations occur on all scales, and equally, changes in DNA can provide adaptations that don't need to filter through to big organisms. So a cool example of some adaptations that I wanted to give you now are found in the archaea, these group of organisms that are superficially similar to bacteria that I mentioned in the material on milestones in evolution. If you don't remember those, you may want to go back and quickly brush up on them. Some of these organisms thrive at many extremes of heat and cold, or different acidities in water at high salinity and pressure, and some of them even at high radiation. And there is plentiful evidence in the archaea of adaptations to their DNA that change the proteins that they create that make them better suited to these extreme environments. Specific examples of that include thermophilic proteins. Those are found in archaea that live in volcanic waters, such as those of the Yellowstone National Park, shown on the right-hand side here. These special proteins, which have evolved in the group, have the ability to retain their structure and function in extremes of temperature at up to 105 degrees Celsius. So they're really very effective adaptations, but all of this is occurring on a really small scale. We know of other changes to proteins in the group that also allow them to function at the high pressures they live in, at high acidity and at high salt concentration. And if you want more examples, I've put a reference on the slide for you here that outlines those all in loads of detail for you. Now, it's worth thinking about, now we've met adaptations, how do these occur? And adaptations can evolve and change through time in numerous ways. A common and really interesting process in the evolution of complex traits is a thing called exaptation. This is often the shift in function of a trait, but I've put a more official definition on the slide for you here. An exaptation is a characteristic that opens up a previously unavailable niche to its possessor. The characteristic may have originated as an adaptation to some other niche, or it could have been a neutral mutation. Okay, so there are many fine examples of this, but to illustrate it, I wanted to give you a really cool example, which is the evolution of feathers from non-avian dinosaurs through to birds. And indeed, the latest research shows that a large range of feather or feather-like morphologies were present in the dinosaurs most closely related to birds. Two examples of fossils are shown on the left-hand side of the slide here, and you can see this kind of dark halo around the fossil in both cases, and these are actually the remains of feathers or feather-like structures. And indeed, there's lots of new research happening at the moment that is making the category of organisms that have feathers broader and broader as people look harder and harder at these fossils to try and find these structures. This research suggests that before feathers were used in flight, they had already evolved to fulfill a wide range of biological roles, including thermoregulation, so helping organisms stay at the same temperature, and visual display. And all of that occurred prior to their co-option into flight. So these were not adapted for flight, but rather they were exapted. They were an exaptation towards flight. And then we see several aerodynamic innovations and flight-related morphologies evolving in the group of organisms that became today's birds. Those likely evolved independently multiple times within the group closest related to the origin of birds. And you can see an example of these changes on the right-hand side here. Here is an evolutionary tree of the non-avian dinosaurs and the birds. And you can see on the right-hand side of this a series of different feathers. And you can see how between numbers 1 and 11 at least, these are becoming increasingly familiar as they're developing a series of different morphologies that make them better and better adapted towards flight. If you want to read more about this, the book that I've referenced on the slide gives you a fantastic and in-depth overview, but also there's some interesting history here in this paper from 2021 I put on the slide if you want to learn about this discovery. Now that's great, but that of course I think raises a really interesting question, which is when an adaptation is not an exaptation of an existing trait, where does it come from? We could, if we wanted to, frame that question in a different way. We could say, what is the origin of evolutionary novelty, right? Not everything can be an adaptation of another thing that was already there. Otherwise, where would new things come from? This, I must tell you, has been the subject of really extensive research and scientific and philosophical debate. A real challenge in this area has been to define what an evolutionary novelty actually is. Now, the paper that I've referenced here gives a definition, which I think does a very good job of trying to combine many of the definitions that are out there into a usable definition. So the definition that I've included here is evolutionary novelties are features at one scale, that could be molecular, morphological, physiological, or behavioral, that in their genetic developmental or environmental contexts have emergent effects across scales. So that's quite a meaty definition. There's quite a lot to take in there, but I thought it could be useful to give you an example to try and highlight what that means. And an example of one such novelty that meets this definition is found in the scorpions, such as these beautiful animals that are shown on the slide here. Scorpions, I must tell you, are unusual arachnids. Arachnids is the group that includes scorpions, but also spiders, harvestmen, mites, and a few other creatures. And scorpions are unusual amongst that group of organisms in the amount of variety in the morphology of their segments as we move from the head to the tail of these animals. For instance, if we take one particular bit of the body, let's look at the tail. And here we can see we've got a body region that's narrower than the body in front of it, and it's dedicated exclusively to prey capture and defense. As you can see in this amazing stance here, scorpions lift their tail up to allow them to sting things in front of them, to allow them to both capture prey, but also to defend them from predators. This is a highly flexible piece of their body, and it has venom glands, and it can even be used to sense light in the group, believe it or not. They've got light sensitive proteins that have been found in their tails. And what's really nice about this is that you don't see that level of variety in the anterior to posterior segments in any other group of arachnids, at least to this extent. So the paper that I've referenced on this slide, Sharma et al. 2014, actually demonstrates that morphological variety stems from the duplication of a number of developmental genes. Scorpions have 2 copies of a number of important developmental genes, and that duplication allows the genes to evolve slightly different functions, facilitating a host of new morphologies and thus functions within the scorpions, thus providing the novelty within that group. So that's a really, really cool finding. But I just wanted to highlight to finish off that this 2023 paper you can see here actually highlights that there is a whole genome duplication in the group that includes the spiders and the scorpions. So this is a broader grouping. And these Hox duplications, these gene duplications, could relate to that. So there's actually a really nuanced and fairly complicated picture building up of the genetics of these organisms. Do check out that 2023 paper from Sharma if you would like to get a more up-to-date overview of exactly where the questions remain within this group. Now, that takes us on to another facet of our understanding of this topic, which I wanted to highlight before I finish the video, and that is the impact of the random nature of genetic changes. So you may remember that changes in genomes and genetics are based on mutations. You may also have heard of the neutral theory of evolution, which suggests that at the molecular level, random or stochastic, that's another word for random, changes of genomes within a population are the core source of variation. So at a very, very fine level of DNA, everything is randomness. I've chosen to represent that with this kind of green and black noise picture on the left-hand side here. Of course, those random changes to DNA are filtered through selection on the whole organism, making evolution on the whole a non-random process. Just like if we took this noise, shrank it down, filtered it through a very clever algorithm, we could no doubt come up with this picture from the matrix on the right-hand side here. So this neutral theory of evolution, to an extent, relates to scale. And I thought I would highlight that the same is true in morphological evolution. At small scales, we might expect to see more random variation. We would call that drift. However, at larger scales, be those temporal, related to time, or spatial, we would expect evolution to be based around adapting to the environment, say. So we would call that adaptive evolution. And so there is an element of scaling here, whereby what we expect to see from evolution depends upon the scale at which we look. So I wanted to finish by highlighting that in this area, we are left with some major but really exciting unanswered questions, which I can't go to in depth, but I wanted to flag to you that these questions exist. If you're wanting to go on to do scientific research for a living, I think these are really good places to look. At the largest scales, those of whole organisms through big expanses of time, there is an ongoing debate regarding the influence of chance and adaptation in evolution. One of several axes of disagreement or discussion regarding this sometimes sees researchers put into opposing camps depending on how important they think the process of adaptation is in evolution. Within this discussion, researchers are sometimes placed into a camp called the adaptationists, and those are researchers in their work where they seek to explain traits through the lens of adaptation and natural selection. So when you look at something, you say, that is an adaptation. And if it's not clear what that's an adaptation to, you look harder to try and find out what it is an adaptation to. Contrasting with that, the other camp that researchers are sometimes placed into are the structuralists, whose work and explanations include constraints on evolution, such as those that result from the development of complex organisms or the physical laws in an organism's environment. I include a reference on this slide to a 1979 paper by Gordon Lewontin, which is very, very famous. It's called The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm. Dr. Pangloss was a character from Voltaire's Candide, as shown on this slide here. And so this is a very controversial paper because it's basically saying, come at me, bro, by these two researchers, and taking on the adaptationist paradigm is well worth a read if you have a chance. I note that my impression is that functionally, many evolutionary researchers nowadays don't actively tend to place their work into the context of adaptationism versus structuralism, and much of the debate regarding this probably since the 1980s and the 1990s, has primarily been led by philosophers of science. And so the second paper that I've put here by Brown in 2023 is one example of a philosophy of science paper based on this divide and the view of the nature of the importance of adaptation in evolution. And as with many things, I suspect the truth here lies somewhere between the extremes of these two camps. Many elements of the phenotype of an organism will undoubtedly reflect adaptation, but my 2 cents is that we also need to remember that the morphology of organisms can also be the result of chance. The morphology of organisms may be linked to another character that is being selected for, or it could be an adaptation towards a previous environment. So not everything necessarily has to be adaptive. Another axis of discussion regards the impact of randomness as represented by this beautiful op art painting on the right-hand side here, and how randomness impacts on evolution at the very largest scale. This asks whether evolution is defined by random events, such as the global event of an asteroid hitting that led to the extinction of the dinosaurs, say, and whether those events will have a lasting effect, or whether despite randomness, do things converge on similar evolutionary solutions to reflect their ecological role? We can package that question amongst a host of others that surround slightly more abstract topics to include the role of contingency in evolution. So the idea of contingency in evolution is how the outcome of evolution may be affected by historical factors. And if it is more affected by historical factors, that makes evolution less repeatable and predictable. And the balance to that, which is determinism. So if you've got a very deterministic picture of evolution, it's more predictable and thus more repeatable. And packaged with this is often a question regarding the prevalence, how common convergence is in evolution. Do things always converge towards similar, say, morphological adaptations within a given ecological niche, or are there multiple ways that they can survive within a niche? It's one of the big outstanding questions. It remains a huge question, and there's lots of research in this area. So the last paper that I put on this slide by Blount et al. In 2018 is a really good read that touches on some of those topics that I think will be really, really rewarding. So thank you for paying attention through all of those big questions, and I'll be back in a few minutes for video number 2, where we'll be looking at concepts and clocks. I'll see you there.